It's FAQ NYC Off-Cycle, where the New Yorkers podcast steps back to take different and deeper looks into some of the things that are always happening here in the only place in the world. I'm Harry Siegel, here with the namesake of the great city book, Harvey Wang's New York, which collects dozens of his photos and text portraits of people, grave diggers, bowling alley mechanics, TV repairmen, burlesque comedians, sign painters, pillow makers, and seltzer bottlers, working in what were already vanishing professions when the book was published in 1990. Harvey is an award-winning filmmaker whose photos are in the collection of the Museum of the City of New York. He's also published 6 other books of photography and was a cinematographer for Paul Auster and Wayne Wang's Blue in the Face. He's showing some of the photos that went into Harvey Wang's New York in a show at the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst, Massachusetts, opening on June 16th, and that's naturally heavy on Jewish images, only some of which were published in the book. There's a lot from the forward there we're going to talk about. Harvey, welcome to FAQ, and let's jump right in. Do you want to tell listeners who haven't seen and read the book yet just a bit about you and how this project came to be way back when, about all these professions that were or seemed to be on their last legs?
Okay, might as well start at the beginning. I was born in Queens, Rosedale, Queens, and started taking pictures as a young teenager. I eventually landed in my first apartment in Chinatown in 1979, living in a loft with 4 roommates, a 5-story walk-up, and using my bicycle to commute to the East Village, which was kind of the center of gravity for people my age at that time, hanging out in clubs like Club 57 and the Mud Club and doing things like that. But in my exploring and biking between Chinatown and the East Village, going through the Lower East Side, Little Italy, I started to notice a lot of businesses closing, stores going out of business. Orchard Street nowadays, if you walk down Orchard Street, you won't recognize it from what it looked like back in 1979, 1980. And I started to do some pictures of some of these old businesses. In my mind, these businesses connected me to my grandfather, who came to this country in 1918. He worked at the Borden Company in Tribeca, candling eggs during the Depression. And I used to hear stories of how he would go to Ratner's and make a meal out of hot water and ketchup and get those famous onion rolls. And so that world of my grandfather's that was still at the very end seemed to be, the metal gates were coming down and the doors were closing, and I started to take some pictures of some of these folks. I met a fabulous book publisher back then named Jim Mars, who worked at Norton, W.W. Norton and Company. And Jim saw my pictures and he basically put the idea in my head. He says, "Why don't you start doing this all over the city? You seem to have a knack for doing these portraits, environmental portraits, and dignifying your subjects and learning about these great stories." So with his encouragement, I began doing a collection of pictures that eventually became Harvey Wang's New York. And when I must have shot, 150 subjects all through the 5 boroughs and found subjects in various ways, always with an eye towards last of their kind, holdouts, people in neighborhoods where the neighborhoods changed around them and they're still there. It was kind of like what I was going for. Mostly older people, because that's the ones who represented that world. And I remember bringing my collection of pictures to Norton at 500 Fifth Avenue and sitting in Jim's office, and he starts to sequence the book, and he says, "Have you thought about a title?" And I said, "No, Jim, I don't know. I don't know what we should call this." And he says, "How about Harvey Wang's New York?" And I said, "Well, wow, but that's kind of like nobody knows who Harvey Wang is. Why would you call a book that?" And he says, "Well, if you call a book that, they'll think they should know who you are, and 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 that's how it came to be. Um, so yeah, the book was published in 1990, and we had a book publishing party in the last Horn and Hard Art, which was very appropriate. And
For younger
a-
listeners, please explain that, because that was the future of the past, right? The automat.
exactly. Yeah, Horn and Hard Art was a restaurant chain which might have begun in Philadelphia. I'm not sure. I don't know. It was ubiquitous in the 30s and 40s, and it was a restaurant where you could go in and put your money into a little. You didn't have to order food from a person. There was a wall of little cubicles, and you put your money in. You and turned the dial, and you opened the door, and you took out your apple pie or your creamed spinach and your cup of coffee, and you sat down. And this was the height of modernity in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and it held on. It held on till there were just one left in 1990 on 42nd Street, and that's where we held the party. We also had Carmine's Italian funeral marching band perform at that opening. Um,
And there's photos of one of the women who worked in the salad department at Horn and
yes,
Hardart in the book, and then of one of the marching band leaders as well, if I recall.
correct. Yes, Helen Giamanco worked at the salad department of Horn and Hardart, and Carmine was in um, uh, Carmine led the band. He's another phenomenal New York story because he had an Italian marching band, and he performed at Chinese funerals. And that's because those funeral parlors that face, like, it's kind of like faces the back of Foley Square, Columbus Park. Um, they were Italian funeral homes, but the neighborhood had become Chinatown, so they were doing Chinese funerals, and somehow the Chinese folks liked this custom of having a band precede the coffin down Mott Street. Um, and I remember Carmine said to me, he was 90 years old when I did the book, and when I took his picture, and he said, with with my trombone in my hands, I feel 10 years younger, which, when you're 90, feeling 10 years younger is not so
Mhm.
young, but
And then the
eh,
kicker there, because these each come with just these brief little chunks of text, but they sing, is once a priest told me, without you, this funeral would have been a dud, which is and it's not a Chinese tradition, right, to have a marching band like that.
not that I know of. Not that I know of, but he certainly adapted to to the neighborhood and created a new custom.
Ooh. So something I don't know, because I was a baby when this book came out. I picked it up at the Strand in the mid '90s, and I've had actually many copies since. My friends have stolen them, and I've replaced them.
Thank you.
But how was it received at the time? There's a beautiful intro I should mention, or forward, by Pete Hamill, and it's a beautiful book. But I have no idea. I just know that my whole map was the Strand, so there are things that were actually sort of obscure, but because they'd have them up front there, to me that was the biggest thing in New York.
Yeah, yeah, me too. And I built my photo book collection by visiting the Strand, weekly. The first initial printing was, I think, 10,000 copies, and it was priced at 9.95, which Jim felt like, let's make a book that was a book about the proletariat priced for anybody, like a photo book that was affordable, a handbook in a way, a handbook to the city. Um, and it was really well received. I was reviewed everywhere. National Geographic got interested in doing a feature about it, and years later, the Guardian newspaper called it one of the 10 best books about New York. And even more importantly for me and in my life is a reporter from National Public Radio approached me to do a feature about the book, and his name was David Isay, and uh, he he was just a guy doing radio stories back then, and we went around and we met a bunch of these people, the seltzer bottler and various um, folks, and he did his brilliant recording, and It aired on a weekend edition. But I formed a friendship with David, and that led to a number of other projects together. So it was well received.
Well, one of those projects is Holding On. And to bring this back to your exhibition from Harvey Wang's New York that's coming up, sadly not in New York, but in Amherst at the Yiddish Book Center. Holding On is a beautiful book, and it's got this incredible introduction by the lost Roth, in my view. Like Philip is still someone who's read and discussed. Joseph still is, but Henry, who might have been the biggest Roth, is in sort of a weird fallow period with readers and thinkers. And I know he wrote this beautiful introduction. You took his portrait that's in the show. Maybe you could talk about that for a minute.
Yeah, I like I like talking about the three Roths because I love all three Roths, but I have to say that Henry Roth resonated with me from the first time I read Call It Sleep, and then meeting him and hearing his life story of writing a book in the 30s, it being published, 1,000 copies maybe were printed. It got, got some good notices, but because of personal problems and political problems and all kinds of issues, mental problems, he kind of went off and just had a life of a laborer in different places. And in the 60s, the book was reprinted, and at that point, it was hailed as a masterpiece, as a masterpiece of Jewish American of American literature. Really, it's the immigrant story. It's very Joycean in his associations. It's a very deep and beautiful book, and when uh, the fact that Henry Roth suffered 60-year writer's block always resonated with me because I've been one prone to writer's block for long periods too. And when at the point I met him in his 80s, he had started writing again and had a flurry of published works at the very end of his life. And he was living in Albuquerque at the time, very old man. I think he didn't even put pants on when we met him. He just sat behind a desk with a shirt on and an attendant who was helping him out because he was alone. Um, and he wrote a beautiful introduction. I don't know if you're going to want to read any of it, or I could,
I'll just mention, and then if you'd like to read some of this, it's brief and it's gorgeous and it feels very resonant now. But Holding On, which you did with I Say, right? Like some of the characters in this, serpent handlers, ooh, um, Boondog Graveyard, spiritualists, newspaper editor, Natch, record collector, justice of the peace. These are the characters and the people who do their things and tell their stories, and they're not doing podcasts. I don't think the AI is even interested in chewing up their content. But it's pretty incredible. And the introduction from Roth, which I hope you'll read a little of, is very brief. It's maybe 400 words, and it is something.
Yeah, it opens, the first sentence says, "It seems to me that in my case, the return to creativity was not a question of doggedly holding on so much as it was a process which doggedly wouldn't let go." And then later he says, "Our eyes will close forever soon enough. And even if you don't believe in a hereafter, you don't believe a thing. Don't close them while they're still open, while you can still see." And then he says, "Exercising creativity helps us preserve one of our proudest, most noble, most precious possessions, dignity." Anyway, it was a great honor to meet Henry Roth, and that this introduction was the last thing he wrote before he passed.
And he wrote it for the book, and he wrote it for the chimney sweeps and the sideshow pitchmen and
Yeah.
and all those characters. Um, so Harvey, I approached you about coming on FAQ before the pandemic, and then I've had a few of these. There's a great artist named Cy Lewin who just painted every day of his life and did incredible work. And then he taught a little, half made a living. He had two novels without words come out in the 40s that were really well received. Einstein wrote the introduction to one of them. And he
Whew.
decided he didn't want to be in the commercial art world. So he just kept painting and kept doing stuff. I visited his house when he was 90. His wife made me about 90, fed me sliced apples. I went in his basement and saw the thousands and thousands of paintings, sort of the result of all this. I had a long conversation with Art Spiegelman just after he passed about him. And then Donald Trump happened. I got very busy at the Daily Beast. And, it just sort of disappeared into the ether, as these things sometimes do. That's one I've always felt guilty about. But forgive me, not to derail. But I'm looking at this and the social dancers. I'm thinking about the forward, which is still there, but there's no more typesetting. There's no more of those incredible plates. Burlesque comedians, knife grinders in their trucks. Like, which of these, as you were collecting this at the time, like which of these professions have sort of had second lives? Which ones have faded? And if you were writing a sequel now, what would the sort of dedicated people who are just doing their thing and there's not an heir or a next generation of those things, like who would they be now? I feel like the nostalgia is sort of turned into to me, a trite Jeremiah Moss mode, where it's all Manhattan. It's like a little bit suicide note bullshit nostalgia. And I just don't get any of that reading your book. It's people who were doing things, and some of them are still there. There's still people checking out the thank God, the cyclone cars and making sure they run and we can have our summer.
Right. Well, it's a great question, and I'll just riff for a minute. This is an era. I mean, everybody talks about, uses the word gentrification, and everyone blames rent of the price of rent for kind of forcing um, this turnover of retail establishments. I mean, people like William Itzkowitz, who had a feather pillow shop on Ludlow Street, and a woman, Veronica Johns, who sold seashells. Jack Bytel, who was a TV repairman in Queens. Uh, Siegfried Liebman had made mannequins out of a storefront in the Bronx. You don't you find Rite Aids and Walgreens and Starbucks in these spaces now, and that's part of the thing I miss most, is the variety of commerce that was possible when the rents weren't so high. And that also applied to the fact that I could live in Chinatown with four friends paying $100 a month. I mean, this is a cliche now about how creative New York was in the 80s. It was also dangerous, and, I had a lot of things going on that were not so pleasant. But the fact was, you could afford to live here, and these businesses could afford to flourish. Um, and the second part of your question is, I tell this to students if I'm ever speaking. Um, anyone could do this project at any time, because New York is ever evolving. I caught a moment when a certain generation, for the most part Jewish, Italian, were aging out. But I mean, shoot, you could probably go to Washington Heights and do this Dominican version. You probably could. Um, uh, the way Sunset Park is switching to becoming a new Chinatown. I'm sure New York is always evolving, and probably at any moment you could go out and photograph something that's disappearing, because it's just the nature of being here.
The secular Jews right now, I think in 1990, it seemed like the Orthodox Jewish world was almost a vestige or an accident after the Holocaust, and a reform world and a sort of secular literary world were taking their place. And for demographic and other reasons, that's actually been a really interesting inversion, where I see like reform temples merging, and then one of the buildings gets abandoned and all that, because there just aren't enough people to fill all the spaces.
It's really funny you should mention that, because the very last film that I did was called The Cantor's Last Cantata. And it was about the cantor, or the spiritual leader of the last Reformed synagogue in Borough Park. They shuttered their doors and they merged with a Reformed synagogue in Ditmas Park. Um, but the film is sweet because it's about a cantor's retirement, but it's also about um, the Brooklyn Dodgers and nostalgia and a community coming together to perform a World War II era operetta about the Dodgers. Anyway, it's sweet, but it brings together a lot of these themes. So it's great. It's great that you mentioned that.
I'm going to see if we can find a little clip of that. Maybe we can put up with the episode.
Yeah, the film is on Vimeo, available for not password protected. So if anyone wants to see it, The Cantor's Last Cantata.
Please, folks, don't hold it against me. I'm not an umpire because I want to be. It isn't that. I've had a very unhappy childhood. This is kind of nervy of me. I just assumed when we were going to rehearse, I'd be the umpire. I've had my revenge, revenge, revenge. I mean, I'm from the Bronx, no less, and so is that umpire in the cantata.
So a year or so ago, we had David Godless on, who now shoots Tribeca and a lot of things like that, but has a couple beautiful books of his street photography and his beach photography. He's got a Miami Beach one, speaking of old Jews, and a New York City one. This really from the 70s with Lucy Sant, and they're having a conversation about it, and I can't say it as well. I don't have it in front of me, but Godless was just talking about how he felt like he was shooting ghosts in some sense. That there's people who I think we all get this as you get older. It's one of the consolations, and they're limited of aging, is maybe a little wisdom, and you get a sense of the point at which what people see when they look in the mirror. And often that's their 19-year-old self or their 23-year-old self or wherever that may be. And so people who were dressing, he said, in the 1970s, who, they were frozen in 1944 and 1957. And he just wanted to capture them while they were still there.
The city had so many different eras in terms of like its architecture and storefronts, but also in terms of people. You're looking at people from other eras. I would look at people and I'd go like, I don't even know what these women are. But, the longer I look at the picture that I took of those women, I'd go like, oh, they're still wearing the same hairdo they had like 30 years ago and walking around in their head like it's 30 years ago. And so are some of the businessmen that I photographed in the 70s were still walking around like it was the 60s in their head. And just for my own interest, I was photographing, again, a city that, you're trying to figure, what is this city? Is it what year am I living in? And when you're living in that year, you don't know. You know books and magazines that tell you what last year was like and what 10 years ago was like, but you're left to your own devices as far as what today's like. And I was going like, I think in a way with photography, you're going, because there's a time machine element to it. I remember thinking, I'm photographing today to show, I want the photograph to still be interesting 20 years from now, and I have the opportunity to photograph today. Sometimes I go like, I'd run into somebody and I'd run into a thing and I'd go, wow, this looks like the 1940s. I'll take some pictures. But in the end, it is whatever day you took it. And then that becomes the timestamp on the picture, and everything in it is the conglomeration of stuff that's around you when you're photographing that day.
And, I thought about that just going back through your book, and to bring that to something specific, what was it like being around the forward and sort of it would turn out to be the end, by the way, of analog photography in hindsight, like the last great days, and just sort of seeing this incredible industrial operation. I think at that point was clearly, going to be a dinosaur soon.
Yeah. Well, God, you touched on so many things. My mind is racing because in high school, I was the editor of the school newspaper, and we were still printing. We printed our newspaper letterpress, which is when you make lead letters and do an impression on paper. And I remember visiting the print shop and smelling the ink and falling in love with the ink and the printing and newspapers. And we switched to offset, which wasn't as exciting to me, but coming into the composing room of the
Hmm.
forward it touched me deeply. The sounds, the smells, the sheer physicality of it, um, the craftsmanship, the precision. The machine is mammoth, so complicated, so complex. It just speaks to the Gutenberg bio. I mean, it was revolutionary. This machine, this Mergenthaler linotype machine, forming hot lead into letters, putting line by line by hand. I mean, the whole thing is just remarkable. So I was lucky to wander into that composing room, and I'm happy that the Yiddish Book Center, has made use of those pictures. Um, but you said something else that you talked about Godless photographing people wearing clothes of the 40s and the 70s. And um, when I came of age as a photographer and got conscious about the fact that this wasn't just a hobby, that there was a tradition to it, and the photographers I first fell in love with were the Depression era photographers and August Sander from Germany. And um, my initial idea of what made a good picture was one that looked like a Walker Evans picture. So I wandered around the city looking for vestiges of a 1930s, 1940s New York, which, which made some good pictures. But I was also living in a moment when, you know, um, Basquiat and Keith Haring were active and making work, and there was a lot of cutting edge stuff going on that I was aware of, but I was kind of looking backwards and not looking forward. And I think it meant there were a lot of things I didn't photograph that 40, 50 years later would have been nice to have recorded.
Hindsight.
So advice to, photographers today is, you got to photograph your times that you're living in.
The whole "you don't know what you got till it's gone" thing, with the passage of time, it just resonates. There's things that feel really eternal when you're growing up, when you're a young adult, because you're building your map and then solidifying and refining it. And then, you look up and it's the whole the days are long, but the years are short thing. It's like, wait a minute, this street is different, this building is different, this storefront. Like, where am I?
I remember hearing R. Crumb, the cartoonist. He had a sketchbook just with telephone poles and wires.
Hmm.
And like someone said, like, why? It's so mundane. It's like nothing. His point was that that is the visual landscape that will be gone, And it's remarkable to think we take for granted we take everything for granted that we see. But as soon as they cut down the big tree on your block and the quality of the light changes, you realize that you took it for granted.
Hmm. The Museum of Natural History, which has had lots of interesting politics around it recently, right? And like Teddy Roosevelt is basically their patron saint,
Hmm.
and lots of things. But they have an exhibition that just shows what their exhibitions were like. I think 100 years ago. And you forget that exists. The same way when you see the newspaper each day, you don't expect this, or you write for a website to just disappear down the memory hole. But so much of this stuff inevitably does. So museums are almost this illusion of, we're saving ourselves from the end of things or the end of this era or whatever. But of course, what they hold and what they preserve, give it a decade or two, and it changes so dramatically.
Yeah,
Even
yeah,
that's just hard to recognize.
yeah, absolutely. I was fortunate after the Holding On book came out. Um, a curator from the Smithsonian Museum of American History. His name was David Shate. Wonderful guy, Shayat. He passed away too young, but he asked me to do an exhibit called Going Strong about older Americans still on the job. And because he was a museum curator, he didn't just want pictures on the wall, he wanted objects. So for instance, he would go to people I photographed and ask to borrow an object that was in the picture. A sign painter has his hand resting on a tool I think it's called a maul, MAHL, so he can do the gold leaf. He got a saw from a Gippo who's a lumberman. It was it was kind of interesting, the idea of objects and things that people use and touch that are in pictures, and he brought it all together. Um,
So that's going to bring us to a few of the photographs. Here's one I don't believe is in the book, unless I've lost track. That is in the exhibit. I love the shot, and it's of a TV repairman in
mm,
Queens, and he's got like the big sign for the DuPont tubes behind him.
right, right. I'm going to tell you. So his name is Jack Bytel. Um, he, we don't fix TVs anymore. And here was a guy that was fixing TVs and VCRs and hi-fis, tube radios. Uh, he said, people throw things out, they don't get them repaired anymore. And he was in that storefront for 37 years in Flushing. Um, and when the landlord wanted to double his rent, that was it. He went out of business. And I want to tell you a funny thing about that Dumont sign. It's actually a sad thing, but it's a personal story. But he was closing up, and I asked him if I could have that sign, that big banner, the Dumont Tubes banner, and he let me have it. And then in one of my moves, it got lost, and it's the one object I've had that I've lost, and I've been for 10 years. I've had an alert on eBay to try to find that object, but it's unfindable.
Oh, that that's biblical. It's human, the human story. But every time one of those things gets lost and can't be found, it's
Right.
Um, so Harvey, thank you for coming on. I
Yeah.
appreciate you taking the time, and I want to take just a little more to go through a few names, and I'm hoping you can sort of tell me and tell listeners. And of course, if you're watching this on YouTube, you can see the pictures there. There'll be links with the episode. But for people who just have this as sounds, if you want to just describe a few of these people and these shots and maybe say a bit about them and what it was like shooting them and what you remember. And I'm going to start with Joey Faye.
Joey Faye was a burlesque comedian. He performed as part of a duo back in the burlesque days, like in those amateur nights when he would go on stage. He made his debut at Minsky's Burlesque in the Republic Theater in 1931. He was with Minsky's until 1938. He told me that burlesque was the poor man's entertainment.
We have a Minsky episode, by the way, Minsky's episode, and about the family. The Minsky's coming up
Oh, yeah?
later this summer. Yeah,
Cool.
just
I love
listen to it.
I mean, just it's kind of fun. This era is way before me, but he just says, he says, in burlesque, a line of girls come out dancing and singing, then they leave. Then two comics come out, usually with a girl, and do a scene. Then out comes the first strip. Then the chorus girls come out and do a number. Basically, it kind of goes like that. So he was one of the comedians. But Joey Faye is most famous for being one of the fruit in the Fruit of the Loom commercials back in the 70s and 80s. There was they had actors playing the fruit in Fruit of the Loom commercials.
That's why Fruit of the Loom introduces the Unbustables, our best-built boys' briefs ever.
With our heaviest pre-shrunk cotton fabric.
This is an age check, right? Like anyone of a specific age from New York can do Food Emporium. Or
Right.
Nobody Beats the Wiz or whatever. And just before that, just with the national TV ads, you work your whole career, your whole life, and then suddenly you're third underwear guy.
Exactly. I mean, and there was a point he had done for 20 years. He worked with a guy named Mickey Deans. They made 200 films called Mack and Meyer for Hire, and these were films that were known to people. Not as famous as Abbott and Costello, but of the same vintage.
So next up, Natalie Spatz.
Okay. So Natalie Spatz in the book her photograph only appears in the afterword, and she was of the family that owned Ratner's Dairy Restaurant, which was a famous dairy restaurant. This location was on Delancey Street. As I mentioned, my grandfather eating those onion rolls. So it was a very famous restaurant. There was a location on 2nd Avenue. And I didn't do a big story about her, but I wanted to have that. The idea of a dairy restaurant is also an idea that has kind of disappeared.
So, two storefronts I'd like to do. Only have one name here. We got Lewis Nathan on by Bayard Street. Bayard
Yeah,
Street. I've
Barrett Street.
never known. And there's a just storefront shot of H. Eckstein and Sons, which weirdly I know not as a physical place, but from a beautiful essay in Mr. Beller's neighborhood about 20 years ago by Amy Zimmer called The Lost Art of Haggling, which is about her grandfather, whose store that was, and her great great grandfather, who went from being a pedal car pusher to a wholesale retail owner, and then through the generations until you get to that store, and then that passing between family members.
Yes. The Eckstein was one of many storefronts I shot around Orchard Street, Streit's Matzah and Shapiro's Wine and various places. But the store Lewis Nathan Used Clothing and the portrait of Max Fuchs is special to me because it was on Bayard Street, which is in Chinatown. And when I was living there, this was the only non-Chinese business on the street. It was between the YU magazine store and the new Sam Key grocery store. And you walk into that location had been there since 1928. He told me that when he opened the store, the neighborhood was all Italian and it was a used clothing market. All the stores sold clothing, especially used clothing. And the rent, he said, was $3. You could rent a bin for $3 a day back then to sell your own clothes. There was an elevated train on the Bowery. One thing he said to me, he says, the store is the same now as it was in 1928. The floor is the same. The tin ceiling is the same. Everything is the same. Only you are here today. So there was a picture of Teddy Roosevelt in the back of the store, which probably was hung during that Roosevelt administration.
I've got two more specific ones I want to ask about, but before I get there, I just want to turn it over to you for a minute, Harvey. If there are just any other stories you want to share or particular photos you'd like to talk about for a minute before we come to our close.
Yeah, I'd love to mention one thing that's not related to this book. The last book I did was called From Darkroom to Daylight, and it's a book about the end of the film era in photography and the transition to digital. And it occurred to me that I was someone interested in the end of eras and the transitions to new technologies. And I realized that in my own profession, this transition to digital really created a stumbling block for me as a photographer because my tools changed and I didn't have the same connection or interest in the new materials. So I said, how do other photographers deal with this? So I did like a Harvey Wang's New York thing about photography, and I interviewed the inventor of the digital camera and the inventor of Photoshop and many famous photographers, Elliot Erwitt and Sally Mann and Alex Webb, many people, I guess it's just been something I've been trying to figure out, like how do you step into the future and also retain the craft and tools of the past.
That's a great mystery. I was just thinking about this, writing about Breslin and like the lost art of the newspaper column. And like there's not going to be print papers around anymore. Just speaking of industrial product, for the word column to have any meaning, or op-ed, right? Which is opposite the editorial page. You don't have pages, these things don't make sense. And this isn't to lament everything new, but these are really lossy evolutions, if they're that. And yeah, I'm starting my running theory. I actually snuck this into a daily news column. Is electricity is the original sin, And everything after that is inevitable and deeply disturbing for all the good and gains that have come with it. So the two closing ones, I'd love for you to talk a bit about Danfield first, and then, if you will, to close us out and to give us some good summer feeling, and that not everything old just goes away any day.
Okay, great. Okay, so Dan Fields was a third generation matchmaker. His grandfather started the business in Russia 65 years before I did the picture. He worked 7 days a week out of a small office on 42nd Street. Um, he makes arrangements, which are arranges matches for clients' children without their knowledge. His fees range from like 25 to 250. So it's before all of these apps. There was Dan Fields. Um,
And what does the sign say his service is?
uh, yeah, what does the sign say? I gotta find the picture. You have it handy?
I got it. It's our service is personal and strictly confidential. And by the way, it is clearly, which is someone else in the book, a hand-lettered sign.
Yeah. Um, and then you mentioned our last, we'll end the show with one of my favorite subjects is Eddie Day. His title is Brakeman at the Cyclone roller coaster, which is the lone remaining wooden roller coaster in Coney Island. And he had, at that point that I photographed him, he had been there longer than any other employee. He began working there in 1962. Um, Before that, he worked on the Tornado, one of the other wooden roller coasters. Some of these names, there was the bobsled, the L.A. Thompson, the Miles Sky Chaser, the Comet, all gone. At the time I did this book, the Thunderbolt was still there, and that's famous from that Woody Allen scene in Annie Hall, maybe, where he recalls his childhood, and he's a bedroom that's built underneath the Thunderbolt. So the Cyclone, as we know, is built in the late 20s. The 9 cars that are used are the original ones. And it's still a thrill ride. You're thrilled by the sound, the smell, and the fact that it seems too rickety to survive, but it's a great ride.
It survived, and somehow, yeah, we've all survived it. Um, that is Annie Hall, which, wow, I guess I haven't seen now in 20 years. So we famously do a lot of fake closes. I'm going to do one more, and I'm going to mention a couple things about it just because I love this one so much. And it's a photograph you took of a newspaper vendor, Dave Hoffman, and he has a round, tired face, like a classic newsboy cap, great collar, and he's holding up a Daily News where the wood, the cover is reborn, exclamation point, which is just so grand. And behind him, if you look closely, you can see the post, which I've looked for, cannot find online. I don't know what the story is, but I can tell you that the headline is "Racial Fur Goes to Court."
I think Fuhrer,
Sure.
yeah, yeah.
Come on. That's a bad. Wow, that's the internet. It all ends up going to Nazis. Racial furor goes down.
Yeah, I had a softness in my heart for news vendors, I have to say. And long before I photographed Dave Hoffman as a high school, kid, I would wander around, and one of my first ideas for a photo essay, I probably just learned what that meant, but was to do the men in the green boxes, portraits of news vendors. And I did a whole bunch of them back in high school. But when I was working on this book, there were fewer and fewer of these guys. And Dave Hoffman, like you said, has the face, the outfit. He looked like a
second generation
cliche.
guy. Second generation guy, son of a blind newspaper vendor, right?
Yeah, they used to write those licenses used to go to disabled veterans. That's true.
Mm-hmm. Oh, Harvey, thank you again for taking the time. This book is Harvey Wang's New York. The Yiddish Center has this show. If you're looking for a good reason to go up to Amherst, Harvey will be there at 2. On that Sunday, I want to say the 14th, but I don't want to be wrong.
It's Father's Day. I think it's the 16th, I think.
Definitely Father's Day. And thank you again for coming on and taking the time. Are you working on any projects right now you just would want people to know about or have a little taste of?
I'm working on two film projects. One about the photographer Gaylord Oscar Heron from Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is a long and interesting story, which I won't go into now. And the other film I'm working on is about the American artist Robert Mallory, who in the 60s was one of the first artists to use a computer to create art. And there's another really interesting story about how I came to do both of those projects. And
We'll have to have you back on.
okay. It was a very nice interview and great questions. And thank you for inviting me.
Pleasure to have you on. Thanks again, Harvey.
FAQ.
FAQ NYC receives support from P&T Knitwear, an independent bookstore, cafe, and event space on Manhattan's Lower East Side, with the podcast studio that can be freely reserved for community use. The pod's friends include the Colin Powell School at CUNY City College, where our co-host, Professor Christina Greer, is one of the Moynihan Public Scholars' inaugural fellows. The City, a nonprofit newsroom delivering hard-hitting news that serves the people of New York. And Flaming Hydra, a collective of 60 writers, including me, delivering a cooperatively owned new newsletter you'll actually want to read. Our engineer is Adam Camara, and I'm our executive producer. A special thank you to our guest, the one and only Harvey Wang, and thank you, listener, for joining us and making it this far. Be kind, be cool, and we'll be back soon with more.